the way we should analyze women's oppression today is not by referring to the way in which women's oppression or gender oppression in general worked before capitalism. So clearly, women's oppression, predates capitalism by far. Like we have millennia of history with it. However, the question is that today we have a very specific form of women's oppression under capitalism, and the reason is that capitalism has basically dissolved patriarchal systems almost everywhere in the world, but this has not led to a liberation of women. Because there are some specific mechanisms in the way capitalism works that contribute to reproduce gender oppression today. So what we are facing today is a specific form of gender oppression, a capitalist, very contemporary, modern form. And this can be better explained if we refer to the notion of social reproduction. And social reproduction refers to the activities, work, and institutions that go into reproducing labor power in Marxist terms, so our capacity to work, which means also the reproduction of the working class as a whole. And under capitalism, all of these activities, labor, is not only feminized, so it's mostly women who perform this labor, but it is also subordinated to production for profits, to accumulation. So just to explain this in very clear terms, capitalism, of course, has the need for the working class to be reproduced. So they need workers. They need workers who are available to go and work. At the same time, reproducing workers means things like not only raising children, so making and raising children, but also socialization, education, the acquisition of determined skills, abilities, dispositions, and so on. And it also includes the maintenance of the worker's family in general. So, for example, care for the elderly, for the sick. Now, all of this has very heavy costs. It is extremely expensive. Why? Because it involves a lot of human labor. It cannot be really entirely mechanized. It cannot be, we cannot really replace childcare with machines, or at least we could try, but we don't know what outcome we will end up having. So it is very expensive. So on the one hand, capitalism needs these activities to happen. On the other hand, of course, it doesn't want to pay the cost for it because it's not cheap. And so what happens is then that there are constantly pressure to lower this cost. One way of doing this, of course, is to have women doing a lot of this labor in the home, in the household, and in an informal and unpaid and non-recognized way. So a lot of care work or reproductive work happens within the family, within the household, and this is not labor that is recognized as labor, and it's not labor that is paid. Another way of lowering cost is, for example, by importing cheap migrant labor. So importing a mass of immigrant women and also men who will then, be caregivers or work as nurses, as house caregivers, or doing, the regular work of, cleaning and so on, both in the households, but also, in companies, in larger buildings, etc. And then the third way that we have also seen, especially after the crisis, but the process had started also earlier, is clearly to cut funds to public services. So in other words, and this is connected to the unpaid women's labor. So in other words, one way of lowering the cost for capital is to eliminate all social public services that would provide childcare or care for the elderly, for the sick, and so on, and forcing then family to re-internalize these kind of activities. So in other words, forcing again women, especially within the family, to do this kind of work for free.
Internalize or naturalize?
And the two things go together, of course. So in other words, the naturalization is, let's say, the cultural, ideological component of this phenomenon, because in order to, somehow put especially women in the situation of having to do this work for free, you need also some kind of narrative that explains why they should do it. And this usually goes through renaturalization of this kind of labor. So in other words, narratives according to which women are naturally caring, more disposed to this kind of work, more welcoming, motherly. The child needs the mother for several years. So there is, of course, all of this cultural element that goes together with the structural and economic processes.
So the reproduction work is part of the capital accumulation.
Yes.
Shortly said.
Yes. Let's say that this is it's like when we speak about unpaid labor that is appropriated in this way. Let's say that this is a cost that is eliminated. Yeah. So in other words, it's a cost that the capital
from capitalist perspective.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And for my opinion, I would say the solution, the end solution, would not be to say this should be paid and everything is all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what's now the consequence in your?
So what would be the solution?
What would be the solution?
So first of all, I must say, the real solution cannot happen under capitalism because this would entail basically really inverting the relationship between the reproduction of people's lives and production for profits. So in other words, it would entail putting people's lives as the goal of the way in which economy is organized. While today, clearly this is not the goal. The goal is accumulation for profits. But in terms of concrete proposals and solutions, I think we will probably need to have a combination of various ways of organizing social reproduction. First of all, clearly a lot of social reproduction should be taken out of the families, of the households. So in other words, this kind of impressive burden on families and households to provide health care and so on should really be lifted. Also because this kind of burden is also one of the causes, not the only one, but one of the causes of a lot of dysfunctions within the family. So one first way would be to re-socialize a lot of reproductive activities. So having basically society taking care of it. Now, what does this concretely mean? It can mean, through forms of collective, cooperative organization, for example, of childcare or care for the elderly. Parts of social reproduction will need to be provided, through state institutions or public institutions, because clearly a certain level of healthcare, especially when we are speaking about serious diseases and so on, cannot really be re-socialized in an autonomous way. But other aspects can. So, for example, as I said, childcare, food preparation, laundries. So all of this can be re-socialized. It can be. It doesn't need to be bureaucratically organized from above. Sorry, it can be reorganized in a cooperative way, self-organized way from below. Of course, this would require having free time. So in other words, it would require working much less in the formal labor market and have much more time to take care of our lives and our interpersonal relationships and our affects and so on. So it really would require a complete reorganization of life.
Social life.
Yes.
And this would be nice.
Yeah, it would be very nice. Yeah.
So this would express something like liberation of life.
Yes.
In a way.
Yeah.
You also mentioned yesterday, I think, something of a liberation of all humanity in the frame of, not in the frame of feminism, of course, but feminism as a tool.
Yes. So the perspective, in the manifesto, What we do is, what we have done in the manifesto was to show how capitalism, various aspects of capitalism, so from climate change to wars and imperialism and colonialism, or accumulation for profits, how these various aspects affect women in specific ways. So in other words, when we speak about climate change, of course this affects us all. But at the same time, a lot of data show that women are at the moment disproportionately affected by climate change. So they are the first victims, and this has to do with the specific social reproductive role that they play in countries, in African countries or in Southeast Asia, where they are basically the main food providers and water providers. Mm-hmm. So that drought and scarcity of food affects directly women, because they are the ones who then have to walk many more miles to manage to get some water, for example. Mm-hmm. And the same, we articulated a similar kind of analysis in relation, for example, to immigration and the plight of immigrant women in particular. So the specific way in which they are oppressed, for example, the use of systematic rape in detention centers, in what we may actually call concentration camps, at the border with Mexico, in Libya, and so on. But by doing this, what we have also shown is that basically we really have a common enemy. So capitalism is affecting women in a disproportionate way, and there is no way in which we can be free, women and queer people can be free within capitalism. But capitalism is clearly affecting negatively, the whole of humanity, or the large majority of humanity. So from this viewpoint, the analysis of the specific way in which capitalism makes women's lives miserable can serve as a general critique of capitalism, and as a general proposal for a new kind of society that is not just for women, but for everybody, for all those who are affected by capitalism, whose lives and existential possibilities are constrained by the way in which capitalism works, or those who lose their lives because of capitalism, joining the Mediterranean Sea, for example, trying to reach Europe, being killed in wars, being killed in the workplace, and so on. Feminism, there are various positions. So in other words, feminism is not a homogeneous theory or a political perspective. So this is, the kind of feminism we want to develop, Feminism for the 99%, is not a feminism against men. Mm-hmm. We do not take men to be a class and to be the enemy. Mm-hmm. We take specific kinds of social relation to be the enemy. So in this case, capitalism. This doesn't mean that that in concrete, everyday life interactions, you don't also have the problem of, the nasty man, the asshole, of course. Yeah. But we shouldn't conflate these interpersonal dynamics in which men do behave like oppressors and even killers with the root causes. Which must be analyzed at the level of social relations in general, the way in which society works in general. So from this viewpoint, then this is not a feminism against men. It is actually, we write in the manifesto that this is not a separatist feminism, for example. And we actually would like to have finally men getting really seriously involved in a project of liberation of women, trans women, queer people, because their own liberation go through the liberation of our liberation. So they are connected. So
it is also a liberation for men in the way of being colonized by capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, metaphorically speaking, yes, of course. Like they are Clearly, they are also subject to exploitation. Racialized men are subject to war, colonialism, racism, racial division of labor. Angela Davis, for example, tells the story about how black women were, during the second wave feminism, were basically criticized, or in any case asked not to organize with black men, and they were criticized for being, somehow subject to black men. And this was because of the separatist tendencies of much of second wave feminism. And of course, this was a big problem because black women clearly had a very strong interest in organizing with black men against racism. So they were not just women, they were black women, they were racialized. And racism was and is still destroying black communities. So to ask them not to organize with black men meant basically to, to be oblivious to the way in which racism affects black women's lives. This is just an example. Another example is, for example, the indigenous women fighting together with their communities to defend their land, from Amazonia to India and so on. So a separatist approach to feminism doesn't take into account the fact that women are oppressed in different ways, and racialized indigenous women clearly suffer from racism too, and that there are robust interests there at stake in organizing and being in solidarity with their communities. So for this reason, in the manifesto, we say we can't go back to separatist feminism. We need, of course, we need a feminist politics, but a feminist politics that is able to shape all kinds of struggles, struggles in which we will work together with men.
What does it mean when you say has a social movement a class character?
I see. Yeah. Okay. What I mean is this. So let's start from what is a class.
Yeah.
And this is a very complicated issue in the sense that within the Marxist and socialist tradition, there are various accounts of what counts as class. Mm-hmm. And this has to do also with the fact that there isn't a real class theory in Marx. In Marx himself, we find competing definitions of what class means. Now, when I speak about the class character of social movements, what I have in mind is, first of all, I'm inspired by the works of authors like E.P. Thompson, or Ellen Maxine Wood, or Daniel Ben Said, who insisted on the notion of class formation. So in other words, a class exists only within the struggle. Of course, we are placed in class positions. So in other words, we are exploited. we occupy a specific place within social relations of production, within capitalism. But at the same time, we manage to organize as a class only following a historical process of struggle and antagonism with another class. Now, since class then is a historical phenomenon, it takes different forms. It cannot take always the same form. So for us, several decades, we had a specific form of class struggle in class, which was based especially on the relevance of industrial working class, and based on a constellation of organizations between social democracy, large unions, and other forms of social communities and organizing connected to the unions, to the social democratic parties, or to the communist and socialist parties. Now, all of this basically has fallen apart, especially with the transformation of social democracies into capitalist parties. They have basically lost their class basis, and with the crisis of unionism everywhere in the world. Now, facing this crisis, we can do two things. The first would be, to look nostalgically at the past and to think that we need to insist in reproducing that kind of constellation, so that kind of articulation, which is gone mostly, and therefore From this perspective, a feminist movement or anti-racist movements, anti-oppression movements would not be part of class struggle. They may be allies of class struggle, but they are not constitutive part of it, because what we have in mind is unions, certain kind of parties, and so certain forms of struggle. A second approach, which is the one I propose, is to look at today at the various mobilizations that are going on around the world, on climate, feminist mobilizations, anti-racist mobilizations, the mobilizations of indigenous people against dispossession, for example, and to see whether these mobilizations present a class character. So in other words, whether they are developing what we may call a class culture, class demands.
In a common sense overall, or do you mean in their each?
Yeah, each of them. So just to be more concrete, this new feminist wave, for example, not only is using the strike, including workplace strike together with reproductive strike. So not only is using what is a traditional tool of the workers' movement, but it is also articulating demands that are directly connected to issues of exploitation, for example. In Italy, the feminist movement is fighting against precarization, casualization of work. Why? Because this impacts especially women. It is fighting for an income of self-determination against gender violence. It is fighting for public services and universal health care. In the United States, we are trying to work on a campaign in defense of reproductive justice, so not just abortion rights, but in general reproductive justice, which means that the women who want to have children have the possibility of having children, which is not given in the United States. Why? Because the healthcare system is private, and because there is a history of eugenic practices that has impacted Black and indigenous Latina women. So in order to fight for reproductive justice, we need to fight for a free universal healthcare, which again is a class demand. So when I speak about a class character of the movement, what I have in mind is the composition of the movement. So who is mobilizing? What kind of social sectors are mobilizing? What kind of demands they are articulating? What kind of forms of struggle they are using? For example, the strike. And this is what leads me to think that the feminist movement has a class character. In some countries, is directly class struggle. So, for example, it is spearheading the opposition to pension reforms or to debt in Argentina, for example. So my invitation is to start, rather than being stuck with the past, is to learn from the past what is to be learned, so we don't have to forget, and at the same time be very attentive to the present, to what is actually happening today, to the way in which people are struggling against capitalism in different forms today. And see whether there is a process of class formation going on, and trying to facilitate this process of class formation. So in other words, the new class struggle will not be identical to the way in which class struggle was 50 years ago. What are the issues on which people are more ready to mobilize today? These include issues of gender, sexuality, race, colonialism, dispossession, and so on. So from this viewpoint, then we have the potentiality of a new class formation that from the very beginning is anti-racist, it is feminist, is for sexual liberation, it is anti-colonial and anti-imperialist. Because in the past we also had class formations that were nationalist or protectionist or even straightforwardly racist. So the positive element that I see today is that there is the opening of space for a new kind of class formation that is actually from the very beginning internationalist, transnational, feminist, anti-racist, and so on. When we speak about the environmental movement, we should also take into account the enormous role played by indigenous communities. in Amazonia, for example, in India, or also the Native Americans in the United States. These were, these are communities that have really produced a level of resistance and struggle and organization that is impressive on environmental issues. In terms of the feminist movement, what I've seen around the world is actually like the mobilization of an enormous mass of young women and queer people, most of whom are either students or precarious workers, or working in the informal sector, so particularly exploited and so on, and also a lot of women working in the formal sector, including in factories. So the composition is actually quite articulated, and it has a class character. But I want to clarify that when I speak about the new class formation, what I have in mind is not, we have to drop the centrality of the workplace. Of course, we can't do this. That's not the point at all. And the notion of a feminist strike is precisely not replacing productive strike, workplace strike with reproductive strikes. It is to unite them, to have them both, and to use reproductive strike as a way to also facilitate processes of organization within the workplace to organize productive strikes. So the problem is not to drop workers, on the contrary, but the issue is to take into account that the workforce is really made of various kinds of workers who work in very different conditions, who are divided by gender and race. Some of them are not even recognized as workers because they work in the informal sector or as unpaid workers. So we need to take into account this diversity and therefore to articulate forms of struggle or organizing that are inclusive of all these kind of sectors. So first of all, the first massive women's strike happened in the 70s in Iceland to demand for wage equality among men and women. And then in 2016, the Polish movement, feminist movement, organized an enormous strike against the abortion ban. And they managed to stop the abortion ban in Poland. And then the Argentinian feminist movement took up the strike and organized an immense strike against gender violence, against femicides. So we organized in the United States in 2017 by taking inspiration from a call for a global women's strike that was already in place. We were not the authors of this. We just helped, because we were in the United States. Let's also be honest about this. We were in the United States and we had big names like Angela Davis and so on, or Nancy Fraser. So this helped us have an enormous visibility that other movements had less, and we put this visibility at the service of the whole movement. But it would be wrong to think that we invented something. We didn't.
But this women's strike is something which started in 2007, this global women's strike, which also happened here in Germany.
Yeah.
And do you think this is something which is developing in the moment, which has a
Yes.
process?
Yeah, absolutely, there is a process. So it started in 2016 in Argentina and Poland. In 2017 we had the first global women's strike, feminist strike, and then we had two more the following years. And each year the strike expanded to new countries. So for example, this year, for the first time, Switzerland organized a massive women's strike in June. And Germany also, for the first time, organized here. And Chile also, for the first time, called for a women's strike, and it was an immense mobilization. So far, it has been expanding. And the idea of the strike, I must say, has been quite successful. So, for example, in 2017, Spain didn't go on strike. But they organized the women's strike in 2018, and it was 5 million people. And then again in 2019, it was 6 million people on strike. So the dynamic, I think, is still an expansive dynamic, not only in terms of numerical expansion in each country, but also in terms of expansion to new countries. And let's see, what is going to happen next year. Clearly, we do have a problem, which is that we cannot just organize one strike after the other. So, in other words, March 8 strikes have played a very important role, but the issue is what to do now with these strikes. So, in other words, what else should the movement do in order to sustain this level of mobilization? I think it has everywhere an anti-neoliberal character. So everywhere it's protesting against austerity policies, but in some countries it has also an more explicit anti-capitalist character. I don't know in Germany, but from what I'm seeing here, for example, it would seem that it is an anti-capitalist feminist festival. Yeah.
And where does the fascination or where does this energy come from?
So, there is in general, I think, in terms of energy, I think, I don't have an explanation for this, but I think I would agree that there is something going on. So in other words, it really, besides the feminist movement, if you look at the various struggles, even the climate change struggle, but also, workplace strikes and so on, women are really at the forefront of the struggle today. So there is an element of activation, and of course, you can also see the symptoms of this in the kind of capitalist cooptation of this. When I was flying here from New York at JFK, there was a huge advertisement by Dior, and it was somewhat inspired by the Handmaid's Tale kind of aesthetics, with two women, one black and one white, and it was sisterhood, 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 and so on. So this is clearly a cooptation of feminist language, but it also says something about the power that we are expressing at the moment. In terms of openness, I think one element may have to do with the fact that this feminist movement has really learned a lot from black feminism, from indigenous feminism. It is not really repeating the mistakes of the past, so it has learned a lot about avoiding to essentialize specific definitions of what it means to be a woman, and has much more attention to the different ways in which women are oppressed, and also the different kinds of women that are around. So, for example, one of the big debates within the movement had to do with the trans women. And although I'm aware that there are still, in some places, still conversation going on about this, I would say that most of the movement is trans-feminist. So in other words, it has rejected the idea that trans women are not women. Trans women are women, and they're part of the movement. Another example is sex work. Again, this is a very contentious issue in some countries. For example, Spain. It was contentious in Argentina. But as a general trend, I think the movement has learned to listen to the voice of the women directly involved. So the sex workers who have been organizing in past decades, who are articulating their demands, their forms of organization. They are not, just victims on behalf of whom we need to talk. They talk themselves about what they want, and I think this has also produced a transformation compared, for example, to second wave feminism. So, in other terms, I think that this movement is probably less normative. And much more open to the various ways in which the different subjectivities at stake, the different kinds of women, different kinds of works women do, and so on, express themselves and express their needs, their desires, and their organizational forms. Of course, I'm biased because I do theory for a living, but no, I do think theory is absolutely central for any kind of emancipatory movement. And I think that one of the elements of strength of this feminist movement is precisely that it has been nourished by a lot of theory that has been produced in previous decades. I think here of queer theory, black feminism, indigenous feminism, various forms of anti-racist feminism, Marxist feminism, and so on. This capacity to really analyze our contemporary forms of capitalism gives us also political tools to better understand the dynamics in which we are operating, the conditions in which we are operating, where we should go, what demands, and so on. So I think we need a constant dialogue between theory and practice, and I would say that in this moment we are having this constant dialogue because we have a lot of feminist theory that is directly political and informing also the movement. It is not always the case in every moment, but let's say this capacity of this analytical capacity to look at the reality in which we operate and also to look at ourselves as a movement is absolutely crucial to understand what comes next, what we should do to articulate a strategy, basically, strategies, tactics, and so on. So I think we should really overcome the divide between theory and practice. As I said yesterday, much of liberal feminism or leaning feminism is what we have called equal opportunity in domination. So it's basically a class-specific kind of feminism. So it's specific to a certain class, upper middle class, let's say, and it demands equality, equal conditions for men and women in basically, managing companies or owning companies or political representation and so on. But this without really having in mind, the necessity of questioning social relations as a whole. So in other words, this is a feminist that doesn't have a problem with the exploitation, provided that there is a significant number of women among the exploiters. So this is a kind of feminism we reject. It's the feminism for the 1%. That doesn't liberate in any way the large mass of women. So we do not want more women in corner offices. We want to get rid of corner offices altogether. So in terms of power, we don't want more women managing power individually. In this kind of power, we want power to be back to the majority of people.